you so much, Dr. Sadana, for the introduction. And thank you all so much for having me here virtually at the University of Houston downtown. I am super excited to be able to join you all today to talk to you all a little bit about my research, the work that I do, but more importantly, to hopefully inspire you all to think deeply and critically about work revolving and engaging inclusion, particularly in post-secondary STEM education. And so I'm going to go ahead and get started with my presentation as I share with you all today a little insight about this idea regarding not having, when good intentions are not good enough, and how we can begin to address challenges of inclusivity in STEM through conceptual specificity and accountability. And so as I enter into the research and the work that I do as a scholar, it is very important for me to share that it is situated within my overall philosophy, paradigm, or worldview. And starting off this conversation to tell you all a little bit more about my philosophy, my paradigm, or my worldview helps then set the stage for the actual rich content that I will be providing regarding thinking about conceptual specificity and accountability structures when looking to engage inclusion activities or practices or programs within STEM education. And so who am I? As Dr. Sadana shared with you all, I am a graduate of the illustrious North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University, receiving a bachelor's in chemistry, where I then attended the University of Miami and graduated with a master's in neuroscience, but with a concentration in neurobiology. Following that, I attended UNC Chapel Hill, where I got my PhD in education with a concentration in learning sciences. And while my educational pedigree tells you all a little bit about my experience, particularly having the ability to attend a historic Black college university in undergrad, a private, predominantly white institution for my master's, and a public, predominantly white institution for my PhD. What I believe is even more important to understanding my identity are the experiences, the promises, the lessons, and the commitments that I have developed, given my ability to traverse these spaces and others. And so when I think about what it means for me to be a scientist and how the skill sets that I had developed through that particular socialization process, I draw on those characteristics and expertise when I enter and engage into the experiences that I'm hosting. When I think about what it means to be born of a family where my grandparents were civil rights activists in Asheville, North Carolina, and the lessons that they instilled in me as a result of their own activism, but as well as a result of their own desires to make changes, I am mindful of what those lessons mean in terms of how I see and understand the world. What it means for me to then adopt my own understanding of activism and how it is that I engage in various community and institutional and then non-institutional spaces to promote advocacy and to foster change helps me also think about how that shapes my worldview and my paradigm and my philosophy, but then also my desire to give back and recognizing that there is so much more to what I believe my purpose is beyond operating within my professional space, as it requires engaging community and sustaining transformation and change. And so ultimately, I share that with you to talk about how I begin to nuance my positionality or my perspective. And this idea that the way in which I look at the world is broader than just my identities, though my identities as a Black cisgendered man, growing up with a strong family background and being socialized in the faith, having a civil servant orientation, and believing strongly in my racial identity shapes then my experiences and my understandings of the world. But then I also think about my privileges going back to that educational pedigree and what that opportunity affords me, and how it is somewhat of a rare cause for me to be a Black African American and to be able to claim that I am a third generation college graduate. And understanding what that privilege affords me, even within this kind of broader landscape. The various exposures and awarenesses that I've developed and obtained through my interactions in life, given my own perceptions and experiences, but also thinking about the stories that I've heard and speaking to different students and engaging different people from across different walks of life, and how that connects to or goes against or challenges or expands the things that I have read, the things that I have studied, and the things that I continue to study. And how all of that begins to culminate into commitments that I make, those political decisions regarding how I understand who I am, what I value, why I value these things, and how that then translates into action, the actual behaviors and outcomes, the decisions that I make, recognizing again that this understanding of the world that I am engaging is so much more broader than just the social identities ascribed to me. And I recognize that that was a significant part of this introduction, focusing on me, but I am doing that intentionally to set the stage for how I, as a scholar activist, present and understand myself, my roles, my responsibilities when it regards engaging work specifically to understanding inclusion in post-secondary STEM education, and what it is that I should be doing with my platform and my power, as well as the pitfalls and the challenges and the dangers that I could potentially fall into if I am not cognizant or aware of how I am understanding and perceiving these things. And it is my hope that in sharing my positionality with you all will begin to think a little bit more deeply about your own positionality as we then have conversations about specifically supporting racially and otherwise minoritized individuals within STEM spaces. So if we were to look at some trends in national data and begin to ascertain the rate in which individuals graduate in science and engineering, or STEM more broadly, we would see that coming from the National Science Foundation, between the years of 2000 and 2015, we kind of have these trend marks regarding different racial groups' experiences and graduation rates. And I see that this data is interesting, and I find that the data in itself communicates differences in representation when it comes to actual graduation rates. But what is even more intriguing for me is when I think about the graduation rates of Black and Brown students compared to their interest rates in coming into our post-secondary institutions and desiring to major in STEM. And when I look specifically at Black students, I find that there is a 23% intention in majoring in STEM versus a 9% graduation rate in staying in STEM that has been relatively consistent over the past 15 years. And when I look at Latinx or Hispanic students, Hispanic being a government designated term, I see that there is a 28% intention in majoring in STEM when entering into our institutions versus a 18% or so graduation rate, going closer towards the end of this trend when it comes to seeing how these students are matriculating. And so when we compare intention, the desire to study STEM, given whatever self-proclaimed goals that these students have, juxtaposed to their graduation rates, this data indicates that something is taking place within their 2 to 6 or so years in our post-secondary institutions that are causing a significant number of individuals to leave and depart our STEM majors. And as a field, particularly given this push to have students enrolled and matriculating through STEM beyond the undergraduate experience and into the graduate and professional experience, there's a lot of curiosity about what's happening and what is the best possible way in which we can begin to address these challenges to promote adequate solutions that attend to these components specifically related to diversity. But when you get into the research literature and you start to have deeper investigations into the various ways that we as STEM educators, policymakers, and even practitioners have begun to interrogate and even address this challenge of retaining the students that are present, you begin to notice that it takes a very fairy godmother-like approach, where in these spaces, our policymakers, our practitioners, and our researchers come and look at our Black and Brown STEM students and specifically as if they were Cinderella pre-transformation, where we then do some fairy godmother magic and window dressing to help transform Cinderella to have a more appropriate attire and have a more appropriate perspective and have a more appropriate engagement within the society or the culture that already exists, thinking that in this perspective, Cinderella or these students need to be given resources. They need to be given things that would help them better fit the social, cultural, political, historical components of our STEM departments, of our STEM disciplines, and our STEM majors. And we see that through programming, where there's a lot of additive approaches that are saying, hey, let us provide mentorship opportunities, let us provide access, let us provide them with financial resources under the guise that in giving them these things, because they do not have these things, that they can automatically become successful in these spaces and that they can be retained in these spaces. And while there are elements to that argument that are true with regards to the lack of access and the lack of opportunities and the lack of resources, the underlying perspective that drives those programming is one that is very much situated within a deficit perspective of the student. It is perceiving that the student is lacking. It is perceiving that the student does not have. It is perceiving that the student is not capable of. It is perceiving that the student does not have the capability to do so without being given and socialized in these perspectives. And so this underlying philosophy in how a lot of STEM programming begins to address inclusion within STEM traces back to those underlying perspectives, perceptions, and positions of the individuals who are leading the STEM programming and the individuals who are researching the STEM programming and the individuals who are shaping the policies and the procedures regarding STEM programming. And those perceptions are very much rooted in their individual or collective understandings, beliefs, and characteristics. Those perceptions are then shaping their experiences, their relationships, and their engagements with students and others. It is influencing their interactions and their behaviors, and it is dictating to some degree how other people perceive, respond to, or even engage with them. And so in essence, the perceptions that we as a field maintain regarding supporting diverse students in STEM and beginning to address some of those issues regarding the challenges of retaining diverse students in STEM is very much a fundamental reflection of who we are as individuals and the positionalities that we maintain, given our understandings of life. And so as I enter into my research and my work and my involvement in studying and understanding inclusive perspectives of STEM education as ways to advocate for those who are minoritized, given these broader systems and structures that operate on people to regulate their social positioning and status, I draw primarily from two central frameworks: phenomenological variant ecological systems theory and critical race theory. Phenomenological variant ecological systems theory, or PVEST, is a framework that combines individuals' perceptions, that phenomenology, how they understand the essence of being, with an ecosystem-like approach to how they are operating within micro, meso, exo, or even macro level experiences, and the extent to which that individual's perception and the environment, those norms, rules, and policies coming from it to regulate their perception, is changing or shifting over time. And I coupled this framework with critical race theory to be very intentional to unpack and to critique the systems of oppression that are present within our macro level environments, general society, that then manifest within our exo level environments, perhaps our institutions, or how we understand our colleges and universities, that can then trickle into our meso level departments, those colleges and or STEM departments, and those micro level environments, be it the STEM classrooms, those extracurricular opportunities, or even research lab spaces, and how we begin to understand structurally the presence of racism and other forms of oppression that attempt to control and to regulate based off of a very standard identity archetype, who is capable of being successful in these spaces and who is able to successfully navigate these spaces if they then accommodate, assimilate, or adapt aspects of themselves to meet those standards and those norms that have been socially regulated through this environment. And so in drawing on this perspective and thinking then about how I am entering into this space, it is my goal in this particular conversation to help expand the ways in which we as a community, leveraging and introducing myself to this space, given the invitation that you all have provided me, expanding the ways in which we begin to think about inclusion by beginning to identify structural root causes that lead to the challenges we see. And so a metaphor that I often use to help people think structurally with regards to diversity and inclusion in STEM is this: if we were walking along a lake and we happened to see one fish belly side up, most people would ask the question, what's wrong with the fish? But if we're walking along that same lake and we happen to see hundreds of thousands of fish belly side up, rather than asking questions about the fish, we begin to ask questions like, what is wrong with the lake? What is wrong with this environment that is causing so many hundreds of thousands of fish to be sick and to not be able to thrive within their natural setting? It is that same metaphor that I hope that we can apply to thinking about diversity and inclusion in STEM. And instead of looking at our STEM spaces and asking what's wrong with people of color, what's wrong with women, what's wrong with first-generation college students, what's wrong with non-traditional students, what's wrong with differently abled students regarding their ability to be successful in STEM, that requires us to add these window dressing-like approaches to help them fit in this environment, that we should begin to think critically about the toxicity of the environment and how it is very much rooted in this perspective that is driven by a white supremacist understanding of identity that has been built into our living experiences within the United States since its inception, given the norms, the policies, and the procedures that were created in founding documents that perceived enslaved Africans as being the physical property of someone else, that perceived women as being lesser than men and not capable of making decisions for themselves, that perceived the indigenous people of these nations as being savages and in need of extermination as we go through this process of Western expansion, that perceives people who did not have the social, political, financial capital, such as the middle and high economic class, as being destitute and poor and unable to make decisions regarding how this nation should be governed and what policies and procedures should be enacted. And how in that foundation, those perspectives have been carried even through to present day, as we think about the earlier incidences that have taken place within our country this year alone, and the presence of this very hateful, hegemonic, white supremacist ideology regarding who deserves access, who has the right to access, who should be considered and favored and privileged over everyone else, from a very constrained perspective of what life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness actually means. And so I take this perspective to say that as we enter into our spaces, and that as we begin to expand our understandings of inclusion, let us look at the root causes, shifting from this idea of thinking about how we can window dress the individual, because these individuals are perceived to be lacking and deficient and the problem, to looking at the system and the structure and the root causes by which we have hundreds of thousands of individuals that are in STEM spaces that are alienating, that are hostile, that are toxic, that are causing challenges for belonging, that are perpetuating oppression on physical, sociological, spiritual, psychological, financial ways. And so you might be asking, what is that connection? And we talked a little bit about defining the root of the problem, but now let's get into conversations about how we understand the implications of structural oppression on our lived experience and behavioral outcomes. But then beyond understanding the connection between the root problem and what's taking place, it is then thinking about how, in taking an inclusive perspective, we have to operate beyond this notion of good intentions, given the fact that this perceived standard or norm or archetype is one that in and of itself is exclusive. And I can have the best intentions in the world, but if I am still operating from this perspective of the standard and then expecting everyone else to be judged according to that standard, then I am still capable of perpetuating oppression through the ways in which that I interact and engage people. And so some of this you can find in my research, doing a quick shameless plug. Should you desire to go in and read some of the work that I've been doing, but it's also connected to broader STEM education research, as there are other scholars who are raising very fundamental questions about this perspective around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how we are thinking intentionally about the different groups that we are serving. Given my focus and my lean to look at race, or my lean to look intersectionally at race, gender for Black women, a lot of my implications that I draw come into this idea of representation, And so the students talk about not only is there inequitable numerical representation in our STEM spaces regarding how we count diversity, but then there is an invisibility in the infrastructure. They are sitting in classroom spaces where our walls are lined with pictures of people that we are hallmarking as scholars of diversity, scholars of science or scholars of engineering or scholars of mathematics that all reflect that very standard hegemonic identity archetype. That there's a lack of role models that are present as we think about who are teaching the courses, who are leading the programs, and the extent to which these people are being appropriately compensated for their work as leaders, both in the presence of the people or if they're being leaders sort of subserviently behind the scenes. The invisibility in their peers, their professors, invisibility within their content. You know, I have conversations with engineers all the time, and I'm being told, well, as long as an engineering student knows how to build a bridge, then they should be able to be successful. And all of that other stuff should not matter. And then I raised the question, well, what if the student comes from a community where there is no bridge? Then why then should they care about engineering a bridge if they are suffering from infrastructural issues like water quality or the ability to fully engage green spaces given the way that their environment is constructed? How then can that be included in their content versus assuming from a very generalist approach that everybody should know how to be able to build a bridge? So we see invisibility in the readings. There's a lack of intentionality in including research and work from diverse authors, which then translate into those problems and those solutions. But this invisibility is then juxtaposed to the hypervisibility that a lot of Black and Brown students experience, where through our classroom spaces, we create very tokenized approaches and very essentialized approaches, where we may hallmark somebody as the norm or the standard from a Black and Brown perspective, saying that this person made it. And because this person did X, Y, and Z in making it, everyone else that looks like this person can make it if they too adopt those same practices that that person does. Not even getting into the nuanced perspective regarding how we understand and conceive this notion of Blackness or brownness and all of the cultural ethnic experiences that go into those different conceptions. We see that their learning experiences are highly racialized, where there is this social emotional anxiety that influences their academic engagement. And so some of the work that I discussed talks about like this racialized metacognition, going into their STEM spaces, perceiving the extent to which the space will be challenging or supportive while thinking through a lens of race, and that cognitive tax that it puts on the mind to think about how should I sit? Where should I sit? What should I say? I don't want to be perceived as someone who is unintelligent because I know that those stereotypes exist. And so having to go through all of these metacognitive thoughts about how to regulate and control their behaviors takes away from the ability to expend that physical energy on actually engaging within their content, which often then puts them in this sort of oppression resilience dichotomy, where their identities as Black and Brown are being socially regulated as a deficit or from a minoritized perspective. And they are having to counter that with their own self-determined understanding of who they are and their power and their agency, deciding for themselves, do I have to assimilate in these spaces, or should I have to accommodate myself to be successful in these spaces? Or should I resist those structures or even be revolutionary in those structures? And we then see that that leads to constrained accessibility and limitations to their continued success. where we have resources and opportunities that we know from a research perspective are necessary to ensure students' continued success, like research opportunities, internships, scholarships, and academic support that are put behind gatekeeping structures so that only the select few can actually access these spaces. And so we have selection criteria, we have norms for access, expectations for engagement that all privilege this idea of a cultural phenomena of whiteness or white adjacent behaviors. If you're not able to show up at this time, then you cannot access this space. Not accounting for students who may be non-traditional, may have a lot of lived experiences like family expectations that they have to account for within their educational structures. And so if they're not your standard 18 to 22-year-old who's living on campus, them showing up to a meeting space at a specific time might be a little bit more challenging than someone else who's only kind of navigating education and nothing else. Expectations for GPA requirements, knowing that those introductory courses like intro biology and chemistry and calculus and algebra are gatekeeping courses that have very weed out like mentalities, where there are professors that still exist to this day that say, look to your left and look to your right, one of you will not be here, who create content and assessments with the intentionality of streamlining and weeding out individuals who do not perceive to be capable of being successful. Or if we even think about the concept of recommendation letters and the social cultural capital that a student must have to be able to reach out to a professor and say, hey, I need a recommendation letter to access this space. Those power differentials of student to professor are already creating some anxiety for some individuals. But then if we layer onto the fact that the professors do not look like them, the professors do not understand their cultural ways of being, then it now becomes how do I approach this scenario in a way that demonstrates that I have great need without positioning myself in a way that looks like I am not capable, because I know that the professor as a human is carrying biases about my abilities to be successful. We see constrained accessibility and limitations when it comes to faculty pedagogy and praxis, where as PhDs, or even as researchers, we are trained very specifically to address the problems of our interest, but we are not trained intentionally to think about teaching and to think about mentoring. Those expectations are just thrown onto faculty once they actually take on a faculty role, unless there has been intentionality in that person to get that experience before becoming a faculty member. Yet, there's still that expectation that the person who is an expert in the content is supposed to be able to be an expert in communicating and disseminating that content, not recognizing, again, those limitations and those shortcomings. And then again, from that very Cinderella fairy godmother approach, and seeing problems with accessibility and continued success, there's even a limitation in how existing efforts attempt to address or even redress those barriers or challenges. And so when we pull out sort of that racialized component to this work, we see the psychological impact that it has from racial micro or macroaggressions and this racial metacognition. We see those social cultural components of racism and race. When we think about norms, when we think about values, when we think about beliefs, and we think about practices. And then we even see those structural components when we think about this idea of tokenism or essentialism, or better yet, even mirrorocracy, where we may claim that things are based off of an individual's merit and how well they're able to perform, but in actuality, how we're engaging this space is based off of who we as the leaders perceive is capable of being successful. And so in essence, we are looking in a mirror when we look to support students so that we have people who are adopting and adapting those same biases and perspectives that we maintain about the cultural phenomena of our STEM spaces. And so to kind of put it graphically, it is taking this idea of thinking about students and the various stress engagements that they are interacting, and how in engaging these stressors, they're having to produce reactive coping mechanisms. And in continually producing reactive coping mechanisms to these daily stressors, they're developing emergent identities, identities that they are deciding for themselves, but also identities that other peoples are projecting onto them. And as they develop these identities, they engage behaviors that can then support their retention, should they decide to be resistant or resilient or to assimilate, or behaviors that could promote their attrition, given their own desire to leave, or given the desires of those in power who then presume that these individuals are not interested, are not capable, and so are not granted then the access to the opportunities that are necessary, or are made to jump over additional barriers in order to gain that access. But then it also requires us to think about then the faculty or the staff's component. And in Googling scientists, we see that this very stereotypical image still kind of drives the broader conceptions of what science is and who can do science or even engineering or mathematics, and the various stressors that the faculty members are going through, given these broader systems and policies and procedures that are manifesting and regulating their experience, and how the faculty's reactive coping informs students' stress engagements, and to some degree how students' reactive coping inform faculty stress engagements. And while existing policies, again, really focus on this, how do we mitigate stress and how do we help people better react, we should start to think about how we can begin to change these sort of fundamental structures regarding norms and values, regarding policies and procedures, and regarding beliefs and practices. And so you may be asking, what exactly does this have to do with me? You've given me a whole lot of things to think about in connecting this sort of broader structural approach to issues that promote the need for inclusion. And you've even given me some implications on behaviors and interactions regarding these broader structural components. Well, what ideologies are you drawing from when you start to think about inclusive practices? Are you adopting a specific framework like critical race theory, or like community cultural wealth, or like Black feminism that really pushes you to think intentionally about the ways that you are supporting people, given your understandings of inclusion and the problem? And are you taking a very dialogic approach where you're embracing your racial realism and realizing that racism is present from a structural component? You're exploring your positionality when you're thinking about the role that you're playing in this space, and when you're thinking about your beliefs and your values. And are you then exposing yourself to seminars such as these, as well as other readings and opportunities to raise your critical consciousness, where in a co-generative dialogic component, working together with community, you're bringing action? So, conceptual specificity for inclusion and structural change regards engaging in dialogic action. It regards centering the voices and the experiences of Black and Brown people in the constructions of policies and procedures related to access, engagement, and standards for success, making sure that those that we are attempting to serve have just as much agency and power to determine for themselves what their experiences should look like, rather than presuming that we have it all when it comes to determining their outcomes. Removing those practices that render perspectives, realities, and knowledge of Black and Brown people as illegitimate. Checking ourselves and our biases. Being in spaces when we hear and know things are being said from a biased perspective, and checking our colleagues and peers, and even maybe our family members, recognizing chronologically how things are being adopted as we move forward. And then establishing and maintaining expectations for this continued development of critical cultural consciousness among all members, both new and current, of the various STEM communities that we are operating in, but ensuring that there is a form of accountability incorporated. We know that there are differences in power based off of the role that a person plays, be it administrator, faculty, professional staff, or student. But we also know that there are differences in power based off of the social identity that a person maintains, be it race, gender, sexuality, socioeconomic status, ability, geographic location. And so how then can we, in knowing these things, create spaces to learn about these things, but also ensure that the people who are responsible for continuing this growth and this development are held accountable, or those people who decide to reject these new procedures are held accountable in ways that are mattering and meaningful, so that the community as a whole continues to grow. And so it is taking this approach that Audre Lorde once said. It is recognizing that in engaging inclusion, that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. It may allow us to temporarily beat the master at its game. We may be able to add some things. We may be able to window dress some things. We may be able to begin to provide some resources, but it will never allow us to really get into those structural issues, because that is not how those tools were designed. Let us think outside the box with the toolkits that we are using, having some conceptual specificity and engaging in forms of accountability. And that is all that I have at this particular moment. And so I appreciate you for entertaining me and welcoming me to your community. And I will take any questions or comments that you may have.
Dr. Morton, thank you for this wonderful talk. We do have some questions. So I'll read the question and send it your way. So the first question is, as faculty of color, how do we advise minoritized and racialized students about the Cinderella analogy, when we ourselves had to use that claw to move up or make it in STEM? So the person is conflicted about this. So this is the question.
I appreciate that question. And how I am interpreting the question is twofold. How do we change the structure while also recognizing that we are having to navigate these experiences ourselves? And so my answer is in alignment with that interpretation. There are very specific skill sets and strategies and tools and resources that we should be providing these students that help them navigate their experiences, that help them better cope with their experiences, that help them understand that what they are feeling is connected to broader structures that have been in existence since the beginning of this country and even before. But then it also means, which is not necessarily fair from an equal perspective, that because we are now in a space as faculty or as professional staff and have been able to gain a platform and have been able to obtain certain power, that we really begin to change those rules and those regulations that required us to even adapt those navigational skills. And it takes somewhat of an incrementalist approach, which I too also struggle with, recognizing that from a very revolutionary perspective, it would be my goal and my desire to just completely remove all oppression so that beginning tomorrow, the next person that enters into my space does not face the same things that I am going through. But in learning and adapting and experiencing more, I'm realizing that not everybody is in line with this full deconstruction, reconstruction perspective. And so while I may advocate for that, I still have a responsibility of pushing change structurally. And when I say that it is not fair, I am not specifically talking about fairness from a perspective of our social identities, because it can be and is problematic if only marginalized people are leading change efforts. Those who are in the majority have to also be part of the leading of change efforts and have to also be willing to and engage practices that distribute power that they have been given. But I speak of fairness from our perspective with regarding the roles that we have. So it's thinking again about, as a faculty member, you have more power in certain arenas than a student. As a professional staff, you have more power in certain arenas than a student. And so it's thinking through that lens of role of how you're helping to create that change, while also still loving on the people that you're serving and making sure that those people have an expansive toolkit. And not only just focusing on the toolkit, because hopefully, each generation is a little bit better than the generation before.
Thank you. So here is another question. Can you give one example of educational practice that is not based on a deficit mindset?
Great question. So some of the projects that I am engaged in now, given some of the grant endeavors and other research that I am doing, draws on the community cultural wealth model that I had shared a little earlier. And so what this community cultural wealth model does is it takes a critical race approach to this idea of social cultural capital. And it says that instead of having to expect people to develop capital associated with these spaces, let us instead look at the capital that they maintain given their lived experience. And so aspirational capital talks about the power of hopes and dreams, and how for minoritized people, hopes and dreams have served as a source of continued empowerment and sustaining them to persist in these spaces. And so taking an aspirational approach to STEM education then means, how am I creating programming that's getting people to say, this is what I desire for myself through STEM? I am entering into biology because I have a strong desire to give back to my community through medicine. And instead of shaming that person for that perspective, we say, all right, if this is your desire to give back to your community and you are entering into biology in these spaces, how do we create content? How do we create activities? How do we create curriculum that specifically connects to this desire to give back? And so instead of saying and doing research and teaching from a generalist approach where we just give them information to memorize, we can take a project-based learning approach where maybe we raise a question about COVID-19 and its differential impact on people from a biological perspective. And in having those conversations, adding in concepts about equity and ethics when it comes to epidemiology and public health and health sciences research, thinking about Henrietta Lacks and thinking about the Tuskegee experiment, the students are able to develop a critical consciousness. They're able to actually see how their goals of changing the community are intertwined with them learning about some of those basic biologic functions. And it is now a space where we are building on their aspirations rather than treating their aspirations as an addendum to the space. And the same can be for linguistic capital. We talk about STEM literacy at the K-12 level and how that serves as a major barrier for continued interactions and engagements. Yet we have this expectation that everybody learns STEM in English, not accounting for their native languages or the fact that many students might be speaking in their native languages in their homes, depending on where they are generationally when it comes to their arrival and interactions and engagements and adaptations of American citizenship. And so instead of saying, I'm going to give you everything in English and expect you to think in English and respond in English and do science in English, it is being intentional to find ways to build off of their native languages so that that understanding is being able to be demonstrated. And so maybe instead of taking a standard multiple choice assessment, they're asked to create a story that allows them to draw on their cultural values. But that story has to have very specific scientific or engineering components so that that content knowledge is not interwoven with their cultural knowledge. And then they can perform that story in ways that associate with their linguistic capital. So it's really thinking differently about how we're teaching, how we're mentoring, and how we're engaging.
So we have a couple of more questions and I'll get to those questions. I just want to make a small announcement and information will be provided by Ms. Fraser at the end. There will be a session with students at 1:30 for an hour and Dr. Morton will engage with students. So there will be some activities and if you have any specific questions, hang around and it will be in a different Zoom room. So we'll wait for that. I want to make sure students don't leave so they know there is another session for students. So getting back to a question, as a minority student, how can we express ourselves to non-minority faculty to bridge this gap? And how can we find commonality and understanding?
It's a great question. So the first thing that I would do before even answering your question is to challenge you to think differently about this concept of minority. Minority in and of itself is pathological, and it assumes that the individual is in a specific space because of their own doing. And it does not assume that the individual is in a specific space because of that broader structure that has regulated them to that space. So just putting on my sort of teaching hat, the first thing is thinking from yourself the value and the worth that you maintain, given your boldness, given your beauty, and given your brilliance. And it is operating from that same perspective when interacting with individuals who are within what Beverly Tatum describes as being dominant identity groups, individuals whose identities align with that standard archetype that I had discussed before. And is having conversations about the love and the efficacy and the care that you carry for yourself, and then thinking about communicating it in ways to say, this is what I need to be whole. This is what I need to be successful. This is what I need given my understanding of life. And it is finding ways to then sort of interpret, for a lack of better words, between the two parties, how those needs kind of boil down. Because even though we may speak the same traditional language, we don't always speak the same cultural language, and our values are not always the same. What we perceive to be normal is not always the same. And it is in entering into that conversation, understanding that as faculty or staff are saying, well, this is what you should do, this is what you should do, this is how you should do it, is setting the precedence for that conversation to be more of a negotiation, recognizing that even if they tell you something, it is not a prescription for success. It is based off of their understandings and their lived experiences and their studies. And I think if you enter into the conversation saying, hey, I recognize that you and I look at the problem from different ways, and I want us to be able to communicate together in a way where I can be successful and you can be successful. And so in having this conversation, this is the mindset that I'm coming from, my own brilliance and my own beauty and my own boldness. I am now asking you to think about that first as you then provide support for me, so that you don't look at it as if I'm the problem, but we're recognizing that it's structural in terms of how we're all interacting.
You know, Dr. Morton, it's so exciting. As you're answering questions, we are receiving more questions. So let's see how many we can answer. I'm hoping we can extend this session by a little bit, like 15 minutes or so. Okay, great.
That's fine.
So the question is, have you had any luck yourself or through your team in changing or shifting STEM faculty perspective in promoting a vision of systemic change in institutions of higher education for people of color? And actually there is a follow-up question. I think the question is, what approach works better, like starting from faculty going up the administration, or this change coming from the administration down to the faculty? The reason provided is faculty have so many things to do, so many things on their plate, so sometimes it's hard to prioritize. So what are your thoughts on that?
Those are all great questions. And I will give some intro thoughts, but will share kind of ahead of time that in a faculty conversation that we're having next week, we'll really get into some more nuancing of this question. So yes, short answer, yes, I have had some successes, but I have also had significant pushback, which has not deterred me from continuing in my work, because in those moments when I find myself feeling extremely challenged or maybe even overwhelmed, as a spiritual person, something always happens that reminds me of my purpose. And so it's that random email from a student that I was not even anticipating or expecting that was like, we see you, we hear you, we value you. Or it is interacting with someone on our way to the car that stops me, that just reminds me again of why I'm here or what I'm doing. And so my strategies to gain those successes have been to take a top-down, bottom-up, middle-out approach. And so there has to be change that comes from the grassroots. Because in a lot of ways, administrators, and several have admitted this themselves, because they are operating in sort of a different capacity, there is loss in interaction with the actual people who are experiencing the policies that they're helping to create. And so to some degree, some administrators lose sight of the everyday experience that a person has. And so that everyday experience from a bottom-up perspective has to be present to help drive change. I'm at the University of Missouri, and it is no secret that the University of Missouri has had a lot of student activism within the past 5 or 6 years. And so students standing up and saying, this is not right, this is what we need, this is how we understand what is happening, have been movements that I've been able to support as well as leverage to say, how can we begin to make change? And then from a middle out perspective, it is starting to identify those who share in similar values and beliefs as me, but then also finding those allies and those co-conspirators, which are two very different type of approaches to engaging this work. And it is leveraging allies and co-conspirators to begin to develop sort of a critical mass across kind of that middle out approach, be it in faculty spaces or professional staff spaces or combined approach to say, hey, within our departments, we need to be raising fundamental questions about inclusion and how our policies and procedures at the departmental level perpetuate deficit perspectives or not. At the college level, we need to be thinking about policies and procedures and cultural practices that communicate to the students that we love them or that we don't love them. And that's based off of what these students are telling us from this bottom-up approach. And we need to be a little bit more intentional in trying to listen and understand what they're saying. And then putting pressure on administration to make changes. But then it also requires allies and co-conspirators at the administrative level who are also thinking a little bit more critically about this approach and who are also from their vantage point saying, if I am juggling responsibilities between supervising and managing people, but then also being out in the community and thinking about fundraisers and donors and all of that other kind of stuff, how am I ensuring that I am listening to the voice that is most critical and most central to my mission? And that challenge then becomes the students as public institutions or as institutions of knowledge who has a responsibility to the public. That is who should be driving our decision-making processes, though that is not always the case, because we know that money makes the world go round, and those that have the money often control what we have access to. So it is a bottom-up, middle-out, top-down approach that has led to some success. But then it's also thinking about broader community structures and how the world itself is in a point where we are being made to contend with this continued system of oppression. I've been doing this work for a while, and there have been people who have been doing this work longer than me. But it took 2020 during a middle of COVID-19 pandemic for us to actually witness what happened to George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and for us to actually understand on a social, emotional, human level what those atrocities were. Never mind the fact that George Floyd and Breonna Taylor were not the first, and unfortunately are not the only, who have been victimized in those kind of ways. But the world was forced to sit with that, which then brought about external pressures. So it's leveraging and capitalizing on those moments, driving those different constituents to really help prop this broader structural change. But then using, again, conceptual specificity in the change that you're promoting, so that you're not just recreating oppression, giving good intentions.
Thank you. Before we move on to our next question, just a reminder, I have posted information about student-only sessions, special session for students with Dr. Morton, where Dr. Morton has planned some engaging activities for you, and there will be engaging discussions. So join in that Zoom room at 1:30, but this is open and we'll be answering questions. Also, the recording of this video will be available on the Synergy website, so that information will also be provided later. So moving on with questions. So the there is a comment and there is a question. I understand that there should be a change in how education is structured. However, to implement this more inclusive and progressive change, would we start now, or should we initiate it with generation of students just starting at school now, like at early stages, as to not affect their education with such a severe turn?
Great question. My response is both. Start now and start at that younger generation. Part of what we see in a lot of young activists is this idea that so many generations of people have been told to just wait. The change is coming. And you see it reflected in the music. As I even said, change is coming. It made me think of Sam Cooke. It made me think of Marvin Gaye. It made me think of some of those spirituals, those Negro spirituals. We shall overcome someday. And if we continue to say, we'll start there, wait until this, start here, wait until this, then that change will never come, because there will always be something else, another uncontrollable variable that we can begin to add to this equation that causes us to question whether or not we should start change. But by implementing change everywhere and ensuring that this new class of people entering into education is where change starts, we are creating for ourselves a space that ensures that the change is actually going to happen. And I recognize that that is scary because it requires a disruption in how we understand kind of those fundamental aspects of life. But that's kind of part of the central message in this keynote or this presentation, how we understand what is even considered to be foundational is very much rooted in a perspective that was intentional to not include everybody. And so there is a deprogramming process. Other scholars talk about decolonizing process that we in ourselves have to go through continually, implementing changes in the spaces where we have control, but then also advocating for changes in spaces where the collective has control. So in my classroom, I tell my students that your grade does not matter to me. What matters to me is how you're demonstrating an understanding of this knowledge that I am providing to you. And it freaks my students out because they're so used to being told that they are smart based off of the letter grade that they receive, that they are capable based off of the letter grade that they receive. And for me, whether you have an A or an F, that doesn't communicate your intelligence or your capabilities. What it communicates to me is how well you performed on whatever biased assessment that I gave you. So I make a change in that space, and then I advocate for change in my departmental meetings. I push for change through my research, and I work to create change through my projects. So it has to be a both and. It can't be a one or the other, in my opinion, at least.
Thank you. A question is, I realize we need to eliminate issues with conformity and expectations on homogeneous behaviors. But I was in a conversation at my former workplace when one participant told another they shouldn't have sounded so smart because they sounded white and they should sound black. Could you give me some perspective on that? Actually, before you answer, I want to thank this participant for sharing such personal and experience and asking for advice. So it's greatly appreciated.
No, and I appreciate that question too. And so there's multiple layers to think through this. So as I was sharing, all of us, no matter who we are, race, gender, sexuality, socioeconomic status, ability, geographic location, language, no matter who we are all operating within this system. Somewhat of an old school analogy is the Matrix movie. We are all operating within this idea of the Matrix. And to some degree, we all buy in to this system. Because even as myself, someone who identifies as a scholar activist engaging this work, I can be critiqued for what it is that I'm doing, for working for a predominantly white institution, for not being on the front lines if there is a protest that is happening. So there is always some sort of concession, some sort of buy-in that everyone has within this system. It is understanding, though, that to some degree, well, not to some, but to a great degree, how we buy into this system is based off of our awareness of the system. And so if this person was saying you should not talk smart because you sound white, you should talk in a way that sounds black, and this person is a person of color who said that, that is because this person doesn't understand structurally how things have been operating to control their lived experience, or even this whole notion of speaking being associated with whiteness, or professionalism, shirt, tie, coat, being assigned with whiteness. And so it's having a deeper conception of where that problem is, and then is thinking about challenging them as well as yourself to say, well, then what is Black? Is Black stereotypical, where I am supposed to be doing all the things that mainstream society says that I'm supposed to be doing as a Black person, given these caricatures that have been created since enslavement, like the Sambo and like the Mammy, and like the Jezebel, if we're thinking about Black women, or the Sapphire, or even the welfare queen, or the lazy individual. What does it actually mean to be Black? And how do we interrogate that given the structural oppressions that are trying to regulate and socialize what we think about ourselves? And how do we push back, recognizing that to be Black means that I, as a Black individual, can determine for myself what my Blackness is? And while there are some biological components to this notion of race, because there is skin tone, and there is morphology, bone structure that can be traced back geographically to where our ancestors are coming from, this idea of Blackness is also social in terms of how we communicate and gather. It is cultural if we think about a Black African American versus a Black Haitian American versus a Black Jamaican American. It is also then political if we think about how I engage my Blackness as a way to say that this is not right, given how Black people are treated, where somebody else may feel that way, but may not take the same steps that I do to advocate for how they feel. So it's nuancing those perspectives and then challenging them, yourself, and others to think about how am I defining it? How am I appreciating my boldness, my beauty, and my brilliance? Leveraging that to continue on my trajectory, but then also taking the opportunity to help unplug others from this matrix.
Thank you. And we have one last question, actually. It's about sharing books or literature you recommend in this matter. If you would send us some of your own articles or something you would like to recommend for in general, please send us and we will share with the participants. So with that, I thank you wholeheartedly, like you took time and presented your work and share your thoughts with us. It's our honor to host us. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And I look forward to conversing with students in about 15 or so minutes.